Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatiron Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatiron's Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatironstuning.com and stay tuned with Flatiron's Tuning. Welcome back, everybody, to the Flatiron Syndicate Podcast. We're here in the shop today. We've got Harvey with us. He's got his laptop in front of him, and that can mean only one thing. It's time to talk data. Actually, It can mean a lot of things, but today on the podcast means it's time to talk data. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the data logs that we collected in the Pikes Peak car through the race week, through the actual race, and basically
and through tuning, initial tuning, on the dyno.
Because this is a window into the behavior of this car that we've never had before. We've never run the car up Pikes Peak with a standalone.
Yep.
So this whole testing process and then the actual race run, this is the first time that we've got this window into what the car is doing.
Oh, yeah.
And fortunately, or unfortunately, we had, the engine issue.
Uh-huh.
And so one of the key details is we can now actually go back to the data and look for maybe some of the key telltale signs.
Which there were two engine issues I can think of, and then there were false alarms too. So data can not only give us an insight into issues, it can give us clarity when we have a false alarm to say, hey, there's nothing wrong here.
There was multiple steps through the race week where if we wouldn't have this data and the information that we got from this data, we would have either continued when we shouldn't have, or stopped what we shouldn't have.
Yeah.
The data let us make the right choice in a couple key situations where we can actually know that the car was okay to run, and we ran, and we put down the time that we did.
Yeah, and I've done race support before for cars running on stock computers where it's the same data I've always been used to. So there was no new data presented, and in those cases I would just go to these races and I would look at the data and say, hey, everything looks great. But because we were looking at things like oil pressure, oil temperature, tire pressures, tire temperatures, coolant pressure even, we were seeing data that the tuner can't do anything about, but I now had the data, so I could raise the flag, or you guys could ask me like, hey, what was that at, and is that normal? And we're all still learning what this data means because it's the first time we have it in a race setting on one of our race cars that we're working with. And so it's the first time that we can actually analyze it in a way that it's like, hey, I have no button that I can raise oil pressure with on the track.
Right.
And I can also say that I can see oil pressures very different on the dynamometer than it is on a hot track or going up a mountain.
Big mountain. Yeah. Well, so maybe let's start with coolant pressure.
Okay.
So people that have been following us know that the main issue that we ran into on race week, this was on Thursday, the qualifying day, was that the car overheated, coolant basically shot into the overflow bottle, sprayed up on the windshield. We knew that there was an overheating issue. That's what prompted us to basically bring the car back here, throw another engine in it, and then go back the next day, which was insane, and the guys did an amazing job to make that happen. But now, in looking at the data, maybe about coolant pressure, what are some of the things that you now are seeing as far as maybe we had some telltale signs before we would have had this red flag issue, that something was wrong.
Yeah, so my side of the story goes like this. Right now I'm opening this log. It's from 4:24 at 10 a.m. So this is like right when I'm getting started tuning. I called you way back in April and I said, I'm scared because I just started tuning this car. And the thing that was scaring me was here's 3 pulls, 4 gears in a row. And if we look at the coolant pressure, you can see it starts out on this first gear. I'm going up. And this is something I don't do on the dyno typically. And I was trying to simulate track conditions.
And this is because you're tuning with the sequential.
Yeah, I'm tuning. So no, this wasn't even the sequential, was it?
It was.
Oh, it was. This is when we first put in the sequential. I had already tuned the car.
Yeah.
I don't even have those logs. It must have been yet a third laptop that is gone in history. But this was when we got the sequential in.
Yeah.
And I started really tuning this and shifting. And I called him because I said, hey, look, I'm seeing 30 pounds here of coolant pressure, 31. Probably the highest here is, I could put up the highest reached on a little value, but let's just scan through so that we have people can see how I'm looking at this data. And here we have 37 pounds of coolant pressure, which is pretty much the same as the moment we saw 40 the moment it blew the coolant and finally let go, which is 2 months later on test day. And so here we see this coolant pressure being this high. So then I'll pull up the log now that was the day of the blowing of the head gasket, which was the 20th.
And just a real quick note here. So we're running water is coolant, so it's just water and water wetter in this car, and because of that, we're running a 2-bar cap. So part of what the math that we're doing here is, so 2 bars, that's 14.7 times 2, which would be, so let's call it 29, 29 in a couple points. That's the pressure threshold where now the cap should start to open, and basically that would mean that the car is overheating. So that's where we're seeing these pressures that are at or above the threshold for this cap, and that's why we're having this cause for concern, because that would possibly indicate that the cooling system is compromised. If you're not running that high pressure of a cap, you've got to look at basically what the pressure is that the cap is designed to hold in the cooling system, and what pressure is in the system, and make sure what we now know in spades is that pressure should be well below the threshold of the cap, is the long and the short of it. But that it's that coolant pressure sensor that's giving us that data.
Yeah, and here on this log, so now I've opened the 8 a.m. log. This is 6:20, 8 a.m. during testing. I just opened another log that was actually the way down, but this one that was the final log of the day. This is the second to last log of the day going up. And this is the moment where we see the coolant pressure finally, this is where it sprayed his windshield with all the coolant.
Right.
And we see coolant pressure here at 3940 pounds. I'll say also, going back a little bit, we put the coolant pressure sensor in the cross pipe on top of the engine. Yep. And that first day, when we had the sequential on the dyno, I called and I was like, this is impossible. This would blow. This
is way back when the Haltech was in it. And we originally had thought, okay, well, it's got to be something to do with this location.
Yeah.
Because we were just using the factory coolant temp sensor location.
Yeah.
It was right in this crossover pipe. It's a small tube. And not having a baseline.
Yeah, not knowing ever seeing anything like this before.
Figured, well, because the car wasn't overheating.
Yeah.
That's the thing. We weren't, there were no secondary issues. There were no secondary signs that the cooling system was not functioning and was not working. In fact, actually, it was right around the same time we went out to the track and tested with Nigel. With the standalone. It was 95 degrees that day, and the cooling system worked from what we could see, the best that it had ever worked.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, I want to say that I seem to remember someone saying that you thought it was evaporating because we were losing coolant. It wasn't overheating. We didn't know anything, but we were losing coolant somewhere and we didn't know.
Right. Well, and we were still seeing the high pressures.
Yes.
We were still seeing the high coolant pressure, but to us at the time, the math was, well, we're seeing this high pressure number. We don't know if this is the right location for the sensor or not, or a good location.
Sure.
And not having the secondary signs of overheating on track, especially on a hot day, we figured, okay, well, the sensor data must be telling us, something that it seems like it would be an issue, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's more related to
and this was actually during a qualifying run on the bottom section. Yep. And it really set us back in our run order. And yet there was one more day of testing, and your employees here did something so heroic. This is not an engine building shop.
Right.
And yet these guys, this is 8 a.m., 8:28, the car comes down.
Yeah.
That's an hour and a half, 2 hour drive away.
Yeah.
Through rush hour Denver traffic.
Yep.
And your guys just loaded the car up. Everyone's hanging their heads low. But some of these guys here that work here said, no, we won't accept that. And they came here, and Jeremy Agostino stepped up with an engine and helped out. And you guys were back on the mountain the very next day. And I will open that log. And this is the first time we have new head gaskets in this engine. And so going back to this type of data, we can see the very first run up is what I'll open on the 21st. And that's less than 24 hours later. This is
which is crazy. I mean, but the nice thing about having the back-to-back is now we can compare. Now we can see what the difference is.
Yeah. So this is the first run up, and here we have the oil or the coolant pressure, and we can see that the coolant pressure during some of these pulls is only 17 pounds, down from 40 pounds.
Yeah.
Wow, what a better situation. But to be noted, this would be meaningless without coolant temperature, which we have. So seeing that the coolant temp is 178 right now, that may play into it as well. that it was lower. I should almost right now go back and see what the coolant temperature was when it blew, because there are later logs. In fact, we can open a log up from later in the day with this new engine to see what happened on, say, a test, 4 tests later that day. Let's see, here's one, 7:54 a.m. Some of these might be the runs down, so if I open one of those, we won't see anything. The cool thing about that, though, is, so now it's up to 196, and we're still seeing, so now the coolant temperature is up to 196, and we're still only seeing 12 pounds of coolant pressure. So we can say now, hey, we've got coolant, we can correlate that the temperature wasn't the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So. And I mean, this is now huge, because we've chased cooling issues with this car for so many years. And we keep getting closer and closer, like figuring out the radiator caps, what we had kind of done wrong there was a huge deal. But now with this piece of data, now we have an indicator where we now know, even if there's no secondary signs, that there's an issue.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're seeing this high coolant pressure, we know that there is a kernel of a head gasket issue that is starting.
Yeah.
And this would be enough cause now to, like, at the beginning of that race, we do that first run and we see that there's this issue. The engine comes out, it gets gone through, new head gaskets, whatever, before we ever have the catastrophic failure.
The interesting thing I want to point out, too, is, like, even if we're doing closed deck and fire rings, does that fire ring encapsulate the head gasket possibility of it would keep the pressure out of the coolant passages.
So it's been a little bit hectic and a little bit hot here of late, which we're dealing with right now, listeners at home. It is summer here, and we are in the middle of summer. It's like going to be 100 degrees again here.
Oh yeah, and 2 forest fires that we can't breathe with around here. It's
all
crazy.
Sorts of stuff. So we haven't split the long block yet, but that's next on the list, is to tear down the long block that we had the issue with to see what the signs are there. So then we'll have the data side of things, but then hopefully maybe there'll be some indications, because again, we had just this one overheat instance, but like hopefully there'll be some other sign, something we can see in the engine, the head gasket, something like that, so that we now have a data point and some kind of a mechanical data point to look and compare to make sure that we get this fixed if it comes up again.
And here's I just opened another log. This is actually the race run, and I'll go back and forth between logs as we talk about it. But this one was actually under duress. We know it was a nice warm engine. 227 is the coolant temp right now at this moment. This is near the top of the mountain, and we can see that the coolant pressure is only 24 pounds at a fairly high RPM. We're at 5,000.
And that's pretty hot. I mean, and again, the reason we're running a 2-bar cap is that the boiling point of water is 212 degrees at sea level, but we're starting at 9,000 feet.
Oh yeah, and so the boiling point goes down and down and down as the vapor pressure, the air above it.
You have to have that high pressure cap to keep the boiling point high. So we're still underneath the boiling point. I believe, you can correct me in the comments, but I want to say with the 2-bar cap with water, the boiling point should be right around 240, 243, something like that. So we're still a good point below where the coolant should be boiling.
Yeah. And the counterpoint to that is, even though the 2-bar cap makes it not boil as much, the atmosphere makes it want to boil easier.
Yeah. and the other kicker is there could be points in the engine somewhere that are over that point, and you're getting like little hot spots.
Sure, yeah.
So this is where something like the cylinder for cooling mod comes in to try and reduce the chances of like some of these recessed corners of the engine getting hotter,
and blowing, and warpage and blowing there, those kinds of things. So we can say, like, now that we have a baseline, we've got the data from the dyno, we've got the data from testing with a head gasket that was probably compromised, and now we've got this new head gasket data with a race during probably one of the most brutal races that an engine can endure on Earth. The hardest
running that we could do to it,
Yeah, I mean, that's and this tells us that 40 pounds was way too much.
It's way too much. And so now we have that baseline, now we know what we're looking for, and if you're running a coolant pressure sensor, now you have at least a sense of what to look for.
Yeah, and as a Subaru enthusiast, I mean, like, how many people would love for some way to know their head gasket is failing and not just be like, that was weird. My car overheated this one time in traffic and it's been fine ever since, but there's a little coolant missing. And then I started it 2 months later and it just went all the way up, and I changed the caps and I changed the radiator and now it's okay again. But then 3 months later, it blew up at the top of a mountain. And
this is the biggest thing where this data is now valuable.
Yeah.
Because this is a window into what's going on. That if we didn't have this, think about not having this data, and what our perspective would be is that something must have happened just on Thursday. We would have just lost the head gasket then. But no, it's actually been percolating for a bit now.
Oh, I like that word.
And ironically.
Perfect.
Yeah. But now we have this indicator, and if you don't have this data, you're running the. It feels like now we'd be running the car blind. I don't have a sense of what's going on, and then it makes everything feel more random.
Yeah.
And then that's one of the frustrations with taking a car to the track and pushing it hard is, everything's fine, everything is not fine. What happened?
How long ago was it not fine? Now we know. The other, as a dyno tuner, I work with, I tell people my main job is setting your ignition advance. We can decide where the boost is. We can decide what the AFRs are. That's really a little bit of a personal choice. I don't think the AFRs are going to change power very much. Despite lean is mean and those kinds of phrases that I grew up with and playing with Holly carburetors and thinking I was doing something. The dyno has illuminated that it's really mainly timing. So me as a dyno calibrator, I won't say I'm bored, but I know my job well, and I know that I go in and I do this. So for you guys to have me in as part of this and to just open up a world of other datas to me, not that even the ones I can't do anything about, I can at least be like, wow, look at this. This is not like the dyno. This is different, and this is new and exciting. And I've always said I want to have data about knowing when an engine's going to spin a bearing, and I have no way to know when an engine's going to spin a bearing. I have no way of knowing when pre-ignition is going to occur. I have no way of knowing when a head gasket's going to blow. This eliminates some of those questions.
This is why you see top race teams running tons and tons of sensors, because the more you have an idea of what you're looking for, like head gasket blowing, now coolant pressure, that can be a key indicator.
Yeah.
We got to talk oil pressure.
Ah, yes.
Because, again, if you've been following us, you know that our oil pressure dropped.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we're going to have to go back through the engine. So we have the engine in the car. We made an amazing run up the mountain. But we now know that, again, like with the data, we're not to the point where we can just take this car, throw it back in the trailer, and go out to our next event. There was indicators on the race run that there was an issue. But we got to actually go back to the first run or the second run of the car on that Friday test section to talk about what we saw, because what's really important with data is context.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to look at all of the pieces of information, everything that happened. Like, this is where the context here with the coolant pressure is so important, because we can go back and look when we're on the dyno months before testing.
Sure.
And we see, okay, well, there's high coolant pressure here, so we know that there's something, a failure that has already started to happen and is percolating. So we got to go and look at what do we see with the oil pressure on the new engine build. So this is Jeremy's head's brand new Type RA block, and we're going back, on Friday testing up the mountain. And you saw something in that first run that you weren't happy with.
Sure, yeah, I did. Well, I'll say to talk about that, I'm going to take it one step even further back to that day that I was concerned with the coolant pressure. We see that long run where I do multiple gears again. I've pulled up this log. And we can see, like, here we are over 100 pounds, or at 98.6 psi, 99.1, the lowest during a shift where the RPMs drop. And the cool thing, folks, that you can do for yourself if you have oil pressure is you can test this stuff in neutral. You don't have to be on a dyno flooring it. You can be in neutral. Your oil pressure, as long as the temperature is the same, is going to behave just like that. And we can see the oil temp was very cold here, 165, and I'm seeing, 100 pounds right here, 100 even. So oil pressure looked good. There is a dip up here down to 76 for no reason that I can see. This was probably cavitation or something weird, or the pickup missed some for a moment. Who knows? But there's one bobble during this final run. But since we're doing such an extended run, this is also data that we can go back and look at and say, what was that? Because by being able to graph it, we aren't just like, I used to film oil pressure gauges while on the dyno and send it to the person. And often You can't really see what any meaning in these needles that are bouncing around.
Right.
It just looks like a blur.
Yeah, this is the value of a standalone, is being able to see these data points in context.
Yeah. So this was good. And then I'll say when we went to the track, it was quite a bit lower. And that's what I'm seeing on all cars is the dyno seems to give the best oil pressure reading. And that's probably because I'm looking at logs and waiting a while. There's a fan on the front of the engine. Everything is cool. And we actually let cars cool down on the dyno unless we're doing this type of durability testing. But even this was a durability test, and the oil temp is only 165.
Yeah.
And I had been tuning this car for like 2 hours at this point.
Well, and to be fair, like oil pressure, I feel pretty confident that there's an indicator with oil pressure that would be like the high coolant pressure that would indicate, okay, well, this is the floor. You can't go below the floor.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
We had a lot of discussions through race week.
Oh, yeah.
Of, where should that floor be?
And honestly, there were moments during the first day of testing where like some of the testing was kind of scrubbed for, you want to keep your driver happy and you want to keep your driver with confidence. And he ran into stuff where it was like, oh, why is this tune messing up? And I would be like, oh, no, my tune's messing up. And the anxiety of being there on the spot during testing and the car isn't functioning and it's cutting out. And then you go into this log and you say, oh, the oil pressure dropped. So the car tried to save itself by going into a limp mode. And then we discuss it for a minute and we're like, well, it's race week. Let's just lower that parameter. Here, I'll open up.
And this is the other thing when we tear the engine in the car that's in there now down is we need to see mechanically, like what are the signs? What are we seeing as far as like the issues? But all right, so let's go to what we saw here.
Here's the oil pressure minimum table. So this is the minimum oil pressure allowed at different oil temperatures and different RPMs. This is the final race day one, which I'm surprised we didn't trip because it says 48 pounds at 235 is the lowest oil pressure. I mean, is that horrible or what? It's dreadful.
It's low. It's not great. It's not ideal.
So yeah, we were being rather relaxed about what was allowable during the race. And if we open up the log from after that heroic head gasket issue, we came back and somehow it was missed to put oil in or something happened because when I opened up the next day, I opened up the very first log of the very first run with the new engine, which would have been 6:10 a.m. on 6:21.
Yep.
And then we look at that. We can see that oil pressure is down at 22 pounds.
So what happened here?
19 pounds.
Yeah, it was pretty low.
Yeah, really low. And I've talked to, I'm going to name drop. I talked to Ian Hayes, who's a great engine builder, and he was saying that if you're seeing 19 pounds, that at the AVCS and cam gears, it is 0.
Right. Well, and so what had happened, brand new engine, and we had brake-in oil, but we only had 4 quarts. So the plan was put in the brake-in oil and then just fill in the rest with, the regular oil, and then we'll change it. But there was a lot going on that day.
Oh, yeah. And these are guys that haven't slept for 24 hours. Literally, they built an engine.
Almost 40 hours.
40 hours, no sleep. And this was a mistake. But you know what? It's a heroic mistake that cost nothing other than a short block.
So one run, definitely not optimal oil pressures. But we see this and then immediately figure out what it is. We put oil in the tank. And then what did we see?
And then they put oil in it, and so then if I open the next one that was probably a run, so this was at 656, 715 is probably the run down, 735 is the next run up. So now they've filled it with oil, and it's actually some of the best oil pressure I've seen out of this engine the whole week of testing. There it dropped to 40 pounds, but in general it was up in the 70s, 75. So we're on a dry sump, and for me, I'm like, man, a dry sump, you should be able to shim up or do something to get it to like 100 and just be happy forever.
Yeah. And
this was even a second dry sump system. Yep. This was a backup system.
This was a brand new dry sump. Yes. We replaced the dry sump pump as we put in the new engine. Mm-hmm. So this is where, man, if you're sitting back and with Pikes Peak being the event that it is, it's a relatively short run, 12 and a half miles once a year. Even if you discover this without this data, you'd probably just say, well, let's put more oil in it and keep running it. And if you don't see a problem, just keep on going.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Seeing that the pressure came back, then we know that, okay, well, at least we have a fighting chance that that mistake is not going to take us out again. But, the important part here is when we look at the oil pressure through the actual race run, this is an important piece of context to know as far as why maybe this is possibly one of the reasons why we're seeing some of the numbers that we're seeing.
Yeah, this is probably it. And I'll say this: there was so much excitement post race. The results were so historically great, and there was so much pride going on. And I think it's amazing and it's deserved. And there was even talk of going to another time attack pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And then we look at the data log and we're like, we're not going anywhere anytime soon or too quickly. Yeah, I mean, you guys could have done another heroic 40-hour.
Right. The data is the key window, though, because knowing that the pressure came back and then for the subsequent testing runs on Friday, okay, where everything looks all right, that's where we knew, okay, we still have a fighting chance of getting a time, making it to the top. So we ran the race and obviously we got a good result. But now again with the data, after the race run, now we know, okay, do not take this car anywhere else. You've got to tear everything down, even though we had really no significant issues. We didn't have any overheating. The cooling, like if we're just looking at the cooling system, the coolant worked great.
Yeah, we fixed it. Yay! Let's go to the next race.
We finally have conquered this problem of keeping the car cool on a race run on a hot day. Cool, but then we looked at the oil pressure and we're like, oh no.
Yeah. This is honestly, I mean, this is like battling OCD or something where like a new trigger will arise as the old trigger goes away. So we've conquered the horribleness of having low or high coolant pressure. But now during the race, we can see we started at oil temp of 153, oil pressure of about 80 at 5,000, 70, whatever, which is normal for this car. It's what we've always seen. Yeah. But as we're going up the mountain, the oil's heating up to 220. Pressures are in the 40s now. And by the final few turns of the run, we're all the way down into the 30s. I've seen 34, 37. So although I don't feel like, I don't think this hurt any of those upper sector times terribly.
Right.
The car wasn't like pulling you down as though it was like seizing as you were driving. In fact, it was so good that it was time to go to another race almost.
Right.
And yet we open this log up and it's like, we probably shouldn't go to another race yet.
Right. And so this, again, knowing what the floor is for oil pressure, this is where I'm curious. Because there's no, from what we can tell, and we haven't completely taken the tank out and opened it and really like got into the very bottom, but we don't really see any particles that would indicate.
I will say also that I turned off the function of the oil pressure safety this day.
Yeah.
Because it would have tripped. You guys would have been slower.
Yep.
On the run because I saw that first log.
Yep.
And I was like,
this is the calculus.
Yeah.
This is the challenge. Like on a race run, and if it was any other event other than Pikes Peak, probably wouldn't have done that.
Yeah. Or if it was a multiple run event where you had 5 runs up Pikes Peak, we would be like, hey, let's lower the value, but keep it at 30 pounds and make this car last the 5 runs. So there's a calculus going on about horrible data that you are going to have to accept just on that day.
But still, like 30 PSI it's not great. But the question is like, okay, well, we're probably at some stage of a bearing failure. The question is, what stage of the bearing failure are we? I mean, if you pull back and you put it in context, this is 12 or 15 miles. Well, let's see. Let's call it 24 miles because it's up and it's down. And a couple of days of running. So maybe like 100 miles of after this potential issue that would have maybe started or percolated. That's my word of the day. The bearing failure. Where are we at mechanically? Because there's no other sign. It's like the same thing with the coolant issue. There's no metal in the oil. There's no visual sign. All we're seeing is the drop in pressure, but we've got the high oil temps as well. So how much of it is the high oil temps? How much of it is possible interference with the bearings that started to open up the clearances or the tolerances? I mean, honestly, with that low amount of oil, it's possible that there's some damage that occurred to the pump rotors. Yeah. Like we won't know that again until we tear everything down.
Sure, yeah.
And see.
But it's great because, I mean, usually the sign of rod knock is rod knock.
Yeah, the sound. And like when it's
and this still doesn't sitting, have it.
Every now and then, like that first startup, you hear a little bit of of something. But I wouldn't say it's rod knock, and then it pretty much immediately goes away once everything is moving. So, again, like with the data, there's a pretty good indicator. This is why we didn't go to another event. It's like, okay, well, we need to pull this engine, tear it down, and go through it.
Yeah.
But it's the data is giving us this window. It's taking the mystery away from a lot of these like little hints that the engine would have given us. And
honestly, like thinking about how much it costs to wire in the Nexus, this is like a $10,000 endeavor. This is expensive. We did it ourselves, so I got the $10,000. No, I'm kidding. But it's like that's how much it costs to do it. And a lot of racers are like, I'm not gonna do that. I just will continue throwing cheap motors in it. But what would have the cost been to go to the next event and just get there and know that you should have never left?
That is the worst case scenario if you're a race team, and especially if you're trailering somewhere. To think everything's fine, you spend all of the money going out to the event, you pay the entry fee, you pay the diesel, the hotels, you get your crew out there, and you have a mechanical failure that takes you out immediately. And that's
in
happened to us a couple
testing.
of times.
Yeah.
So that's what happened to us when we went to Kona a couple of years ago. We had the first bout of overheating, and we were if we would have been looking at coolant pressure before then, we probably would have done something before we even headed out. But that's exactly what happened. All of a sudden, we can't get a half lap at Kona without coolant just coming all over the windshield.
Sure, yeah. And I'll say there was one other, I don't want to move on yet, but at the same time, I don't want to forget about crankcase pressure.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's his pet and our pet. Like it's our mutual pet that is probably a lot of views on the video about crankcase pressure. And we love that data. I love that data to this day. Yep. And, it's a case where I'll say we had that data here too. And we learned from it as well. On that one, what was it? There was a day that the second day of testing, it was a week after the first day of testing that I was present for. There was probably testing in between, but the car had been mothballed for a week after being run hard, and they were loading it up and it was smoking and startup, and I got to testing and they were like, well, we're probably not going to test, or we're going to go back. And I was like, well, let's see what happens. I don't see anything wrong here. And watching crankcase pressure will tell you for sure if you have a broken piston and should go home. Right. And we saw nothing. So here's another case where the data was false alarm, but it was just like good old mechanical smell data.
Well, it was the what we were seeing empirically on the car. A lot of concern, but then you're looking at the data points and the crankcase pressure was in line. Nothing, no surprises, and it was just something to do with the car sitting, and we ran the car a couple times, smoke went away, and
never came back.
Yeah, not an issue.
So and there were actual plans pretty much that day to be like, oh, we got to arrange to go build a new engine.
Right.
It's so great to have data that basically was a viral video about crankcase pressure, and it's something that I still love looking at and has become so good for me on the dyno, and it came in clutch here.
To an extent, what I'm realizing is this is one of the things these are things that Subaru doesn't give you. The factory ECU doesn't have, Subaru doesn't include them. And again, it's like that those windows are closed. You're blind to these details. And again, this is where I think there's a lot more variability, it feels like, with Subarus in tracking them, because you don't have like the oil pressure data. I mean, something as simple as oil pressure. Coolant pressure is a little bit more of a weird one. But like now, having seen what it is, like for a race car, like, man, that's a pretty key piece of data.
Yeah. A Subaru, they have an oil pressure sensor that reads 5 psi and turns off a dummy light, something like that.
And it's not actually recorded by the ECU.
Yeah, it's not recorded by the ECU. It's just a light on the dash, and so it's so neat. And I can't think of a car on earth that's ever come out with crankcase pressure from the factory. There's just not
that's true.
care for it.
I would argue that there should be, but yeah, it's so this is where if you have a race car, this is the advantage in going to a standalone where you can add all of these sensors to give you these windows into what's going on to the engine, so that you really know, like if all of these key data points are checking the boxes of normal, everything's fine, and if some of these are checking the boxes of like, hey, or not checking the boxes and something's off, you would know immediately, okay, we'll stop, let's tear the thing down, put in a spare engine, whatever. The readings go back to normal, steady she goes, off you go, and you're probably going to have a really reliable, good event because the engine is running properly, and then you can come back and go through the engine when you have time instead of like as fast as you possibly can with no sleep.
Yeah.
So,
No, it was all so heroic. I can think of other sensor data that was so clutch, even though it didn't work all the time. The tire pressures, the tire temperatures,
Yeah.
that came in very useful. And I think even on race day, a lot of other teams were saying it was greasy, and we were not seeing that because you guys had decided on based on temperature and pressure data, and we struggled with tire pressures and temperatures during testing, but made some decisions with regard to tire warming and compounds that let Scott be probably one of the few drivers that didn't feel like he had a greasy car going up that mountain.
He was perfectly happy with it.
Yeah.
And it's all of these other pieces of data that we're learning that are important, and learning how to add them in and log them, and just the value of it.
Yeah, no, it's great. And even though we had that data, the data is so important, and we have these playback things, and apparently all the batteries had died in the sensors on the race. But what's it going to do on the race? We want the data for looking at. But at this point, that would have been great for next time. But the fact is, it worked when it mattered during testing, and it gave you insight to what to do.
Yeah.
So if this was, say, the last race he's ever going to do, we don't need it on race day because there's nothing you can do about it. And it's sad to see this screen where it's asleep.
I know.
All the sensors are asleep.
We were really curious because the temperature of the track or of the road is so much different on race day compared to any of the practice, that to know what the pressures were at the summit, because also the tires are expanding as the elevation goes up, and temperature wise, just to see what it would be. But next year.
Yeah,
we'll get it next year, and then
with fresh batteries and a little tire pressure sensor.
You just start building this information, and this is where the reliability comes from. I mean, I kind of think that what I'm going to say is anybody that says Subarus are unreliable, I'm going to say, where's your data? And I don't mean like, here's my rod that shot it. No, like, where is your data? Because if you don't know what's going on,
sure,
how much of this was something that randomly happened, or how much of this was self-inflicted from whatever could have possibly started this thing happening days ago, weeks ago, months ago, that you just saw the catastrophic failure at the very end. But if you have data and you're looking at it, because again, like we overheated, but that engine that we pulled out, I mean, it's not catastrophic.
Yeah.
There's no horrific failure there. And even when it's in the car with this low oil pressure, no bearing material that we've found as of yet. There's nothing catastrophic there. But we have the data to know, okay, well, something happened, and we have the context to know, like, what, for the initial startup, for the race run, for the temperatures they was put through, all these sorts of things. Okay, we've done some harm to this engine. It's time to go through it before we keep running the car and that sort of thing. So you've got to have the data. That's the key window.
And something else I'd like to point out, which is really neat for what you guys did for this effort, is that this was all done on pretty much stock RA blocks. The replacement during the race was a little bit upgraded, but pretty close to stock for the most part.
It was a brand new stock RA block.
That's right.
Because that's what we had on hand. And then, there were basically minimal changes. Stock cams, I think I want to say GSC valves, not stock valves, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah, so it's pretty reliable engine, I would say, for a stock engine to be able to set such a historic time up a race like that. Despite it having issues that were probably have explanations, I think it's amazing to see what a stock engine can do. You guys are associated with so many great engine builders, and I mean, even a Roger Clark engine could have been put in there. And yet, it's like,
and a lot of it, the reason we haven't done that yet is because we've had all these problems on stock short blocks, and we had it again here, and so it's just we know that we haven't conquered all of these problems yet. So why put a really expensive engine in if you can't be sure that you're going to keep it cool? If you can't be sure if you're going to be able to maintain oil pressure?
Mm-hmm.
But now we've got the data, and we have enough that I think we're now to the point where something else.
It's time to party.
It's time to party. Exactly. We'll see. More on that to follow. But as we're winding down here, Harvey, my question for you, and we've kind of talked about this before we started, is so you as a tuner, now you seeing all of this data in context. How meaningful is that to you, and what kind of a change do you think you're going to make when you're tuning other cars that are for competition or high power track use, anything like that?
Yeah, even any car that has high revs now, I demand oil pressure, and I don't get temperature all the time, but I at least demand seeing oil pressure. And I like to say that I tested on the dyno mainly, but I have to take these cars out on the road, and I even will do multiple gear passes on the dyno now just to see those oil temps go up and see what the pressure does. That's the biggest change, I'll say. I don't think I'll be putting in coolant pressure into cars very often.
That is more challenging.
Yeah, that's pretty challenging, especially like when most of the cars I'm still not doing standalones on. Yeah. So they're street cars for the most part that I'm tuning, and those cars, that won't change much at all. But these guys who are revving out to 9,500, doing big money builds with us, where it's like, hey, I just bought a $14,000 long block that's timed that I want to drop in, and go ahead and push it hard. And I'm like, if you don't have fuel pressure on it, I'm not doing it. If you don't have oil pressure on it, I'm not doing it. We're going to stay at 7,000 RPMs and 20 pounds of boost or whatever I think the fuel system can maintain. But if you want to go further, we need this data for me to be able to feel comfortable about tuning the car, because I already had an IAG 950 where they just spec'd an 11 millimeter oil pump just out of the box, Subaru one, and the car is supposed to rev to 8,500, and I'm seeing so much weird cavitation and weird oil pressure that it's like I've sent logs to IAG of that, and luckily that car's on a standalone. It's an old 90s legacy, so it's easy to put it on a standalone or whatever and keep it pretty compliant. So yeah, I like to say that the high power builds, this is definitely for guys with Cobb access ports on stage 2 cars that are green speed. Probably not going to get a lot of the data, but if they want to do things like high revs or whatever, at least oil pressure and fuel pressure has to go in there.
Even a gauge, if it's not directly data logged, is better than no window at all into what's going on. And then the Cobb guys are talking about maybe the CAN bus cars being able to add sensors, which would be really cool. So that even with an access port, you could potentially log oil pressure in context, maybe even coolant pressure or whatever, or crankcase pressure in context. Yeah,
and they have one input right now. It's mainly used for fuel pressure. Yeah. For an analog fuel pressure to come in.
It's still down the road, but now that's where the CAN bus is pretty exciting.
But I think not that I know how their CAN bus stuff works, but I know that on the GTR it's already expanded to more than one function, four functions. Yeah, so that's I think that'd be neat for Subaru.
And especially because we now see the value of the data, and if you have to go to a standalone for a lot of race cars, for us, like I did not know how much value there was in a standalone, and I didn't think we needed it, and so we put it off until we really had to do it with the sequential. But now I wish we would have done it earlier. Yeah. Because like for all of these other years, we probably would have gotten to the crux of our cooling problem sooner, and like we're basically 1 year in, and one event, maybe 2 events with the standalone, and we've learned so much. Like if I could have accelerated that learning to 2 or 3 years ago, boy, that would have been great.
For sure, yeah. And I feel, it's grown me as a tuner. Again, not that I'm bored just playing with timing, but it's really let me be aware of other data that even if I can't do anything about, I can at least advise and say, hey, we need to do something about oil pressure or coolant pressure or whatever.
And it shows that, like, if it's a race car and if it's going to be on track when it's hot or crazy high elevation or like always going uphill, like the hill climb, whatever, you can see with the standalone where the tune is fine and everything else is fine everywhere else, but then you put it into this one crazy unique scenario or situation, and then a fault starts to happen. Yeah, like there's an issue that crops up. You can kind of see, you have a better window with all this data to see what that issue is, so that you have a better chance to catch it before it's critical, or to know what it is so you can actually troubleshoot it and actually fix it. Yeah. And then keep the car reliable.
Oh, yeah. And I'll say also something I'd like to add is that spinning bearings happens as a dyno tuner. Like I remember before I was a dyno tuner, I was a hot rodder. Like I had muscle cars and things like that, and those rev out to about 5,200, 5,300. I had a 383 and a Mopar, and I would never redline my cars as a kid. Like I was like 18 to 25, drag racing a lot, and I was maybe at the drag strip I would take it to redline as I shifted. I had a manual valve body 727 torque flight, and you rarely go to redline. But as a guy who takes used cars that people buy and pass on to each other and sometimes go low on oil, they are known to consume oil, which is Subarus and turbo cars in general. So often we get cars in, and these are new owners that are like, I bought this car for a deal. I just strapped on this big turbo and big injectors. I can't wait till you tune it for me. And it's got 160,000 miles on the short block.
Oh boy.
And they're like, hey, can I go to higher revs? And I'm always like, no, you can't. But even going to redline on an engine that's suffered low oil pressure in the past and survived, like your engine did here, you just run into rod knock. Like, I'll take a car to redline with 170, 200,000 miles on it. And then I come down and then I hear it and I'm like, or it'll seize on the way down and turn itself off. And then you start it up and you hear that and you're just like, oh man, it's rod knock again. And it doesn't happen often, but it happens enough on the dyno that, geez, I'd love to have oil pressure. So even a stock redline, a car with high miles, it would be great to have this data. And this illuminates sort of how cars can survive these low oil situations and go on to last a while. And I'm the first guy to take it to redline after these events. And I'm probably even in many of these cars' lives, 170,000 miles, 250,000 miles.
Yeah.
I'm the first guy to ever go to redline. And then people will get on the internet and be like, oh, don't go to that guy. My engine spun a bearing on his dyno. Well, and it's like, sometimes I just, and even a brand new Subaru can do that.
Well, the analogy that comes to mind here is like bending a spoon. And when we were talking about transmissions and 5 speeds a lot, this is an analogy that I use a lot, which is, you have a spoon and you bend it back and it's fine. You bend it back, it's still fine. And you got to sit there and bend it and go back and forth, but there's one point where it bends and you go back and it snaps. Mm-hmm. And like with transmissions, that's additive fatigue and shock load that basically is causing fatigue in the metal. And then there's that one point which always for some reason is somebody pulling out of a grocery store after picking up some ice cream, and then it snaps.
Yeah, and it's not when you're flooring it. It's not during that duress.
Right. And so the aspect of for the drivetrains that was missing is the realization of like all of those times like where you're doing a hard acceleration, the roll on, a launch. There's fatigue that's building up. That's the multiple bends of the spoon where it doesn't break, but you're adding that fatigue in. Yeah. And then at some point you're over the tipping point and you have the failure. But like cooling systems, bearings, oiling systems, it's analogous to that. Because a lot of times it seems like it's something that everything was totally fine until it wasn't, and then it was catastrophic. But what we see with all this data is like probably if we would go and run up Pikes Peak again right now with that same engine, good chance we would have some relatively significant issue, possibly a bearing failure, possibly send a rod up through the engine. Yeah. With the data, I can tell you with reasonable certainty that that's probably what would happen. That's why we didn't go and run something the next weekend, because this engine is probably hurt. We bent the spoon too many times.
And all this extra data is like taking a jeweler's loop, looking at that spoon and saying, hey, look, I not only see little fissures, I see beach marks. I can see that the metallurgy is starting to fatigue. Right. I can see that this spoon is actually cracked in places.
Yep. And now we have a data point for coolant, the head gaskets, where we can see, okay, how many times have we bent the spoon? Time to pull the engine out. And then the crankcase pressure is similar, like, for the ringlands and pistons themselves. Once you get enough of those windows in to see what's going on, you can see where the additive fatigue is starting to build up. Sure. Before you have the catastrophic failure, so that you can pull the engine, go through it, hopefully find the mechanical issues, find a fix for it, and get the car running back again. Yeah. I mean, I think it's...
It's wonderful.
I mean, the fact I was going to say too,
and it saves parts too. I mean, I think we all know that. I mean, it probably has metal floating around in it at this point anyway. But hopefully being caught by the filter. But there's a moment where when bearings really spin and they send huge particles through everything, and the oil filter will bypass. Because it's the best case, and it just sends glitter into your journals everywhere else. It'll destroy all the parts that you are. That you need to not destroy. And I'm actually here buying cam gears and solenoids for my new engine because of that.
Yeah, there you go. Well, and that's what you want to avoid. You want to avoid the spontaneous catastrophic failure at the track or at an event, and all of the fallout damage that comes from that spectacular failure.
Oh yeah, broken rod. And here's the thing. I remember one time. Here's a story. We had a Cosworth engine, and we snapped a rod at the drag strip, and I was like, wow, our engine has so much power. It snapped a rod. It destroyed the case halves because the broken piece of rod went into the wall of the cylinder, and it just destroyed everything. This data would have helped us a lot not to have that happen. But the other thing is that I was beginning, and I used to think that it was really hard to do that. But my old boss, Gary from Super Repair, he picks up the rod and he looks at the strap and he says, oh no, that wasn't our power breaking a rod. You can see a rainbow of discoloration around the cap and the end of the rod that goes around the crank. And he's like, this was a seizing rod. And what broke it was just the spoon. It was a bending spoon going back and forth as that seizing bearing was fighting the locomotion.
The resistance was causing the stress,
So I didn't bend a rod from horsepower. I bent a rod from a bearing seizing. And this could have avoided that. Yeah. So those catastrophic failures, not just sending glitter into your other parts and having to buy new solenoids and cam gears. It's more
in turbos and cylinder
heads. It's expensive closed deck case halves that you're with fire rings that you're trying to save.
Exactly.
With this data preemptively, which is the best thing you can do. Is more data, more safety. And then I'll also illuminate that finally that all of these things, we have parameters in that ECU that during normal testing sessions and races, we have pretty high standards for what's allowable, and we will put the car into limp modes. And as a tuner, it's embarrassing when a car goes into limp mode because you assume it's your tuning. But it's been great to see.
It shouldn't be embarrassing though.
No, it's not.
That was the other argument for putting the standalone in. What happened to us that really started moving me in this direction is one of the engines that we lost was because we had basically a hose or hose clamp fail on the cooling system. And it was another qualifying day where Scott, the car starts out, you go around this bend, and then you check or cross the start line, and that's when the time starts. You went around the bend, the hose failed, it dumped all of the water out of the cooling system, and there was no indicator.
Mm-hmm.
And he drove the whole qualifying run with no liquid in the cooling system and torched the engine. And I mean torched, like melted.
Like I heard the heads were like welded to the block or something weird.
The heads weren't welded to the block, but there was actually holes that had burned from the combustion chambers through into the water jacket. And like
the
melted.
Engine kept running, and that was now your extra exhaust was the cooling system.
Yeah, and nothing from that engine was salvageable. I mean, it was torched literally. But there was no indicator. Like the oil temps, they spiked, but it was like one little warning light on a gauge.
And that engine had lasted years of events.
A couple, like 3 years.
3 years of doing events, and it was a flood damaged car that was the original engine.
No, this was the
second engine. Okay.
This is the second engine. But so that's actually why we put the coolant pressure on in the first place, because I figured, well, I want to have an indicator where if we just dump the coolant, that something comes on and it shuts the engine down.
Sure.
Because, I mean, it's like you think about it, $1, $2 hose clamp, or maybe a $10 hose.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, or $2 O-ring, whatever. One of these small failures that can dump all the liquid out can completely take out the engine in a catastrophic way. So what we wanted to find is a way to have some kind of an indicator to save the engine in that case. So a lot of these safeguards, they're good, and they can, once you know what these floors are for what these values could be or should be, you can put the safeguards in there. And again, it's because when the driver's driving, you want the driver to just focus on that and that alone.
Sure,
you really don't want them focused on all of the data and the dash and the gauges and all that, because then they're not really paying attention to what they really should be doing, which is driving the car.
Yeah. And that brings up another idea is that you can have a bandwidth that you're targeting with coolant pressure, not just high pressure, but also low pressure.
Yep.
So the hose pops off, you want to see that. You want to save the engine by shutting it down then.
Right.
I never thought about this because I think most of these safety tables, you can set it either high or low.
Right.
We want one with a window where it's like, hey, if it's 0 or like low pressure at high RPMs, or if it's high pressure at high RPMs, we don't like either one of those things.
Yep. And so there's a value to that, because the standalones give you the ability to set up all those tables so that you can have the safeguards in place, but you can also not, know when you get into these situations like boost pressure, oil temps get high, whatever, that you don't put the car into a limp mode. You have control over it. Whereas a lot of the OEs, they have safeguards in place, probably for good reason, but then you get out to a track, and then all of a sudden you're hitting these limits, and now the car goes into limp mode, and that's no fun.
Yeah.
Like I want to say the Focus RS was notorious for hitting these. So
from the factory even, yeah. And I'll say usually when I'm setting up these standalones with the safeties like this, we run into these safeguards before we thought we would, and for strange reasons, because the data is so jumpy sometimes that you'll set one of these things and you don't set a delay time, or you set it shorter than you need, and you get too close to what you think is safe, and so you give the car back to the customer with a standalone with all this stuff set up. And I've even had it where we do that probably 4 or 5 times, where it's like, hey, go take it for a test drive. And they come back and they're like, oh, there's something wrong with your tune. And we look at the data and it's like, oh, the oil pressure is lower than it was on the dyno. So let me lower that value because it's still, 70, 80 pounds. And we had it set to 90 because that's what it was on the dyno. And I've seen that with customers as well. So even though this stuff is all very good at catching and saving your engine, it also has to be...
There's a huge value there.
Oh, yeah.
There's a huge value. I mean, if you're going to spend $10,000 to install a standalone, but it saves a $15,000, $20,000 engine because of a $2 hose clamp or a $10 hose that fails, that's $10,000 well spent.
Oh, yeah. Or the drive to California to a race and all that money plus your time. Just a week of doing something, doing a nice drive.
Yeah. Nice don't feel bad when one of those safeties comes up. It's just like, all right, let's calibrate it. Let's figure out, was this something real? Is it okay?
Sure.
Figure it out.
Yeah. And there were moments, I'll say, with the oil pressure and the going lower and lower during testing week before we had the worst issues with oil pressure, where I was still a little concerned, and I just felt weird, like, hey, if I lower this value anymore, am I going to get, like, are they going to be sort of mad at me when this engine spins a bearing at 50 pounds or something?
Well, and us as the team that are working with you to make the decision, like, that's our decision. Like, you're not telling us, we're telling you. Yeah. We're guiding you, like, okay, well, this is the threshold that we feel comfortable with. This is the threshold we don't feel comfortable with. And that's, I think for us as a driver, as an owner, as a team that's working with the tuner, we have to keep that in mind too. Yeah,
and I'll say, it was, I felt on the spot, I didn't know what to look at our first tuning or test session, our first test day. I had never done this with so much data before. So there was like, they would come back and they've only got like 15 minutes till they go again. Yeah. And I remember that first run back, it had hit some oil pressure cuts. And I was like, like I said, I felt embarrassed. I felt on the spot. I was like, they're here for me to make this go well, and it's not going well right now. And then within 5 minutes, we found it, and I felt like a hero. I was like, oh, you need to lower the oil pressure threshold to let him go up the mountain with confidence. And it's race week, so let's do it to give him not only seat time, but confidence in his driving and his ability, and in the car as well.
But that's why there's so much testing.
Yeah. And then by like the third or fourth session, I'm making these tabs that I'm calling oil pressure. I'm making engine sensors playback, where we're watching all this stuff, the map, oil pressure, injector pressure. We're looking at all the stuff that we can. AFR tuning playback, where we're looking at the feedback from the oxygen sensor, the boost control. We've got these tables where after 2 or 3 test sessions, I could quickly just go through and then just go like that and say, get in the car and go. Yeah. You're great. And then it got to the point where I was saying, hey, do you want more boost? Would you do like a degree of timing? Because when I got there, I'll say I lowered the boost and I pulled out some timing for the first testing. And so after like maybe the second or third day, he was starting to ask for more power and ask for more boost and things like that. And everything went well. The whole time, the strain gauge was invaluable on the shifter. Mm-hmm. The gear position indicator was invaluable. It's probably, I'll say I'd never set up a sequential before in a standalone, and I'd heard all these stories about the timing of it and the timers and how you can make it happen so fast. And honestly, we ended up with a strategy that was basically going to make it happen as fast as he could move the lever. Right. And there was no question, did you time it long enough? Because essentially the second it was in the next gear, it gave it the power back. And I was even should I give the power back as quickly as I am? Because I was giving it back within no time at all. I was just saying, hey, you're in the next gear, give it the power and go. And I was like, well, that'll help, but would it induce shock loads that could break a gear or do something like that? But does power coming on really give it a shock load that way? I don't think it does. does compared to like dropping a clutch or
No, it's like happening through rotations of the engine and individual combustion events. It's like, there's 4 combustion events per complete cycle.
Yeah.
So you're basically bringing them back in as these events are happening.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more progressive than a clutch drop.
Yeah.
Which is...
Or landing from a jump.
Yeah, there's that.
It always trips me out how small a Subaru axle is, and these guys are doing 200-foot jumps, and I'm like, how did that not just strip the gears backwards? The gears are even pointed the wrong direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's where you can see, bends in the axle or twists. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, these cars, because I look at other cars with like, you see these diesel videos where they've twisted drive shafts and how big the axles are and stuff like that. And here we have a guy with a car, maybe it weighs half as much, but it just landed from 150 foot of distance. And yeah, the tires are going to take up some of the slip and stuff like that, but that's a lot of shock load. Yeah. So anyway, that's an aside.
Yeah. Long and short of it is, data is cool.
Data is the best.
And data is a window into all this. And what if you think things are happening for seemingly no reason and it seems very random, I think it means you need more sensors.
Yeah.
If things are too random, you need more sensors.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Who was it? I think Tony Palo from T1 Race Development once made a statement that was essentially like, I saw him posted on Facebook, and he was like, the only thing that more data brings is more questions as well. So as you dive deeper and deeper, you're opening up new rabbit holes to go study and things like that. So it helps, and it is truly what you want. You don't want to just say, oh, I don't want any data. Let's just build it and drive it hard and take away sensors. You need more data.
It's a way to go. I mean, that old saying, ignorance is bliss.
It is, yeah.
And it is, because if you just don't know, you put on the blinders and you just drive the car, and it's fine until it's not.
Yeah, and I'll say I have cars that were that way that lasted so many years. I remember the white car that I own now. Mm-hmm. It was on a Walbro 255 with factory wiring, RS factory wiring, like 98 RS, running a 30R at 480 wheel for about a decade, and on ethanol,
just a little while,
3,000 cc injectors, and I'm like, none of that is even believable to me at this point. Now that I have data, I'm like, no, that's your fuel. My fuel pressure must have been dipping so low, and how did it even have the right AFRs? I had a wideband; it had the right AFRs, but I don't know why. And so I think if I had put on fuel pressure and oil pressure and other things, I would probably have stopped driving that car years before. Yeah. And ignorance is bliss.
Ignorance is bliss. but when something feels random, you need more sensors.
Yeah.
Like, it's not random. None of these things are random. So very cool. Well, Harvey, thank you so much for all your help. Thanks for everything you did for Race Week, and it's just so interesting to go through the data with you. And hopefully you guys at home enjoy this. And we're just going to keep figuring this car out. Like I said, engine package is next on the list. And rinse and repeat.
Yeah. And now that I've done this, I'd like to offer my services to other race teams online. I don't do this as a living. I mainly tune street cars and things like that. But this is so interesting and fun, and I'm very careful. So
it's cool how this can inform one can inform the other.
Yeah. And I think I think I'd love to do this more. So with you guys and other people,
you can see where people get the bug of going off and running with race teams and. Complicated ECUs and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And I'm, I'll say I was impressed with my usefulness much more than I thought I would be, because in the past with just factory computers, again, there was only so much to look at, and their ignorance was bliss for the tuner.
And for us as the team. Because when we were running the stock ECU, it was just like go, and everything's fine. Is the car on fire? No. Is it running? Cool. All right, do another run.
Send me a data log. Oh, look, no knock. AFRs look rich. Have a great day.
It was simpler times. But I'd like to think, especially with some of these cooling issues, that we could have saved ourselves so much, heartbreak and frustration to have this data in. And so that's where going forward, to have it. I mean, I'm very tempted actually to put one of these in the rally car, because that's a different scenario, but it's also very challenging. Going back, to the beginning, if you guys heard horn honk, that was the rally car going off to the Land's End hill climb, which also is pretty high at elevation. But you don't have any of this data in the rally car, and not making as much power, and it's a completely different environment. But still, to be able to to set this up and see what's going on, like I definitely see the value now.
Yeah.
So.
I'll also say that like if you're doing this with the reason this was so expensive is it's a Nexus R5 that there's you can get a plug and play adapter, but it totally takes out getting rid of the factory wiring. It takes out the PDM is almost not used at that point because you're still running through fuse boxes and all that stuff. So this was a little more of an investment because we wanted to do it right.
It doesn't have to be that expensive.
No, getting an Elite 2500 with a plug and play harness, we can add all the same sensors into that data stream and keep the car safe. So honestly, a lot of race cars that aren't so wouldn't be this would cost less than $4,000 to do it on a normal car that you could plug and play.
And again, it seems expensive, but when you compare it to the cost of an engine and possibly saving an engine from a head gasket failure or a catastrophic failure, it's an investment to keep the engine running.
Oh yeah.
I look at the standalone as the same way as a dry sump. The dry sump is expensive up front, but it's going to give you more consistent results. It's going to increase the engine longevity. Mm-hmm. It pays for itself over time. Standalones do the same thing. Yeah,
I'm a fan. Definitely not an emissions legal thing, but this is a race car, so.
And for race cars, that's where it's the most important because you're pushing it hard for its entire life, and you're paying entry fees. You're trailing it to wherever the event is, especially if it's cross country. I mean, it could be so expensive. I mean, geez, yeah. So it's worth the investment to have the window, to have the data. So, yeah. Well, thanks thanks you at home for watching. Thanks for your support as always. Go, check out Harvey, the Boostcreep on Instagram, the Facebook, the YouTube, see what he's up to. And we're going to keep plugging away with this Pikes Peak car. There will probably be more data discussions in the future, and hopefully with really good results.
Yeah, and those were really good results. This was really good results.
Now we know. I think we can do. We know we can do better. We can find more time.
Oh yeah, and there's things that we didn't talk about with this car that we want to improve still, even in the tuning realm. And I hope I'm always a part of this effort. It's this gave me the bug to go to Pikes Peak. I've done it before as a spectator, and I think the most beautiful thing is that it's not much different than being a part of the team. That is one of the few grassroots races where you can be standing next to legends, true automotive legends, and they are normal people. And just the mixture of seeing like Ford engineers hanging out with this crazy electric car, standing next to some guy with another pickup truck that's on a carburetor that just came from the South. It's just so cool. And you get both that crazy electric sound, you get this like big block sound, you get it all, and everybody's nice and everybody's trying to help everybody else. Nobody's really racing against the other guy until it's race day. And even then, everyone's helping everyone. Yeah, it's still the clock. It's still everyone helping everyone else.
Yeah, it's a really unique race environment for sure.
Yeah,
and that's what keeps us coming back. I mean, it's a fun, and I hear I've not driven it at speed, but I hear the road is pretty fun. So that's what keeps a lot of the drivers coming back to. So yeah, it's a fun event. So till next year, till next time, stay tuned to Flatirons Tuning. Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatiron Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatirons.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.